The air on the base tasted of jet fuel and hot asphalt. It was a familiar taste to Major Evelyn Reed, a scent she'd known since she was a little girl watching her father climb into the cockpit of his fighter jet. But today it tasted different. It tasted like a challenge. The Langkawi International Maritime and Aerospace Exhibition, LIMA 2011, was just around the corner, and the air crackled with the energy of pilots from all over the world. Massive C-17s had been landing for days, disgorging the best flying machines on the planet. The French had sent their Dassault Rafale, a sleek, delta-winged marvel that looked like it was breaking the sound barrier even when it was parked. The Russians were there with their Su-30 and MiG-29, powerful beasts known for their aggressive, almost impossible maneuvers. And the Americans, well, they had sent Major Evelyn Reed and her A-18 Hornet. Eve loved her Hornet. She called it Old Faithful. It was a reliable, powerful jet, a workhorse that had served the Navy and Marine Corps for decades. But standing on the flight line, watching the ground crews swarm around the other nation's planes, she couldn't help but feel a pang of, not envy, but something close to it. The other jets were the stars of the show. They were newer, faster, and flashier. Her Hornet, with its sturdy frame and familiar lines, felt like a classic car at a sports car rally. The other American pilots, all men, had been assigned to fly the newer Super Hornets, the F-16s, or to run logistics for the VIPs. Eve, however, had been chosen for the solo aerobatics display. It should have been an honor, and a part of her knew it was, but another part of her heard the whispers in the ready room and the mess hall. "They're giving the old bird to Reed," she'd overheard a young lieutenant say to his friend, his voice dripping with a mix of pity and amusement. "Guess they figure she can't do much damage with it." His friend had chuckled. "It's a PR move. Show the world we got female pilots. Thorne's probably just ticking a box." The name Thorne hung in the air like a storm cloud. Colonel Marcus Thorne was their commanding officer for the deployment. He was a man carved from granite, with eyes that seemed to see every flaw and a voice that could strip paint from a bulkhead. He was old school, a pilot who had cut his teeth in the Cold War and believed that the cockpit was a man's world. He never said it outright, of course. He was too disciplined for that. But you could feel it in the way he looked at her, in the way he assigned her tasks. It was a quiet, constant pressure, a silent challenge to prove she belonged. Thorne had called her into his temporary office that morning. The room was sparse, just a metal desk and 2 chairs. He didn't ask her to sit. He stood by the window, looking out at the flight line, his hands clasped behind his back. "Major Reed," he began, his voice flat, "your assignment is the solo demonstration. You'll be flying against some of the most advanced aircraft in the world. The Rafale, the Sukhoi, they're going to put on a show." He turned to face her, and his eyes were cold. "Your job is to represent the United States Air Force with professionalism. You are not to take unnecessary risks. The Hornet is an older airframe. Know its limits. Do not try to compete with the hotshots in their fancy new toys. Just fly a clean, conservative routine." "Am I understood?" "Yes, Colonel," Eve said, her voice steady, betraying none of the fire that was building in her stomach. Conservative? Clean? That wasn't who she was. That wasn't who her father had raised her to be. Her dad, Captain Hawk Reed, had been a legend. He could make a jet dance. He used to tell her, "Evie, anyone can fly fast in a straight line. But the real art is in the turns, in the moments between the noise. It's not about the plane, kiddo. It's about the pilot." He'd been gone for 10 years now, his life taken not by an enemy missile, but by a cruel twist of fate in a training accident. But his words were etched into her soul. She walked out of Thorne's office and headed for her plane. Her ground crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant named Sal, was waiting for her. Sal had been working on jets since before Ev was born. He didn't say much, but he didn't have to. He gave her a slow nod, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "She's ready for you, Major." Purring like a kitten, Eve ran a gloved hand along the fuselage of her Hornet. The metal was warm under the Malaysian sun. She felt a connection to it, a partnership. This wasn't just a machine. It was an extension of her will, her heart. The whispers, the condescending looks, the colonel's dismissive orders, they all faded away. Here, by her jet, she was in control. As she climbed the ladder and settled into the familiar cockpit, she could see the other pilots gathering to watch the first practice runs. The French pilot, a man with a confident swagger, was already striding towards his Rafale. He caught her eye and gave her a little salute that felt more like a dismissal than a sign of respect. Eve ignored him. She strapped herself in, the clicks and snaps of the buckles a comforting ritual. She went through her pre-flight checklist, her movements precise and economical. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "It's not about the plane, kiddo. It's about the pilot." She took a deep breath, the filtered oxygen filling her lungs. She looked out at the runway stretching before her, a ribbon of possibility. Colonel Thorne wanted a conservative flight. The young pilots expected her to fail. The world was watching. A slow smile touched Eve's lips. She keyed her mic. "Tower, this is Valkyrie 1. Ready for takeoff." She was going to give them a show, all right, but it wasn't going to be the one they expected. The first few days of practice were a brutal, sweat-soaked grind. The Malaysian heat was relentless, turning the cockpit into a sauna before she even started the engines. Eve pushed the Hornet harder than she ever had before. Colonel Thorne's order to be conservative was a constant, nagging voice in the back of her head, but her father's voice was louder. "Find the edge, Evie. That's where the magic happens." She flew her routine again and again, refining every turn, every roll, every climb. She wasn't trying to match the raw, brute force of the Su-30 or the high-tech agility of the Rafale. She couldn't. The Hornet, for all its strengths, had its limits. Instead, she focused on precision, on grace. She was a surgeon with a scalpel, while they were lumberjacks with chainsaws. Her routine was a story, a ballet of controlled aggression. It started with a powerful, thunderous takeoff, the twin engines roaring their defiance. Then, a series of tight, high-G turns that pressed her deep into her seat, making her grunt with the effort. She transitioned into a slow, graceful barrel roll, almost hanging in the air, showing off the plane's stability. The centerpiece was a maneuver her father had perfected, a move he called the Hawk's Talon. It was a dizzying combination of a vertical climb followed by a stall turn, dropping the plane backwards, tail first, before flipping it over and diving back towards the earth. It was a high-risk, high-skill maneuver that put immense stress on both the pilot and the airframe. Colonel Thorne would have a fit if he knew she was attempting it. After each flight, she would sit with Sal and go over the telemetry data. He would point out tiny fluctuations in engine performance or hydraulic pressure. "You're pushing her right to the line, Major," he'd say, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "She can take it. But you gotta be careful. There's no room for error." Eve knew he was right. Every muscle in her body ached. The G-forces left a constellation of tiny broken blood vessels, known as G-measles, on her arms and torso. But she felt alive. She felt focused. She was in her element. The other pilots kept their distance, watching her from the sidelines with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. The French Rafale pilot, whose name she learned was Jean-Pierre, or JP, as he liked to be called, was particularly interested. He would often be there when she landed, leaning against a hangar wall with a smirk on his face. One afternoon, he approached her as she was debriefing with Sal. "Major Ree," he said, his English smooth and confident. "An impressive display of nostalgia." He gestured towards her Hornet. "It is a fine museum piece. You fly it with spirit." Eve just nodded, refusing to take the bait. "It gets the job done." "Perhaps," JP said, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "But I noticed you struggle with the transition out of your vertical climb. You lose too much energy. The Rafale, she is different. She has the power to spare. But with your Hornet, you should try kicking the rudder a little harder to the left just before the stall. It will help the nose come around faster. A little trick we use." He smiled, a flash of white teeth. "Just a friendly piece of advice. We are all allies here, no?" He gave her a charming wink and walked away, leaving Eve with a strange feeling in her gut. It sounded plausible. A little rudder input could indeed influence a stall. But it also felt wrong. Her instincts, honed by thousands of hours in the air, screamed at her. Her father had always taught her to trust the feel of the plane, to listen to what it was telling her. JP's advice felt like a foreign language, a dialect her Hornet didn't speak. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Was she being too proud? Was he genuinely trying to help? The next day, she decided to try it. Not the full maneuver, but a modified, safer version at a higher altitude. She took the Hornet up, the sky a brilliant, endless blue around her. She began the vertical climb, the G-forces building, the world shrinking to the instruments in front of her. As the plane neared the apex of its climb, just as the controls started to feel mushy, she remembered JP's words. "Kick the rudder a little harder to the left." She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then did it. She pushed the left rudder pedal. The effect was instantaneous and violent. Instead of the nose neatly slicing around, the Hornet's tail seemed to snap sideways as if kicked by an invisible giant. The plane entered a flat spin. The world outside her canopy became a terrifying, dizzying blur of blue and green. Alarms blared in the cockpit. The calm voice of the onboard computer, bitching Betty, started chanting, "Warning, warning, spin." This was bad. A flat spin in a Hornet was notoriously difficult to recover from. She was losing altitude fast. Her training kicked in. She fought the instinct to pull back on the stick. Instead, she pushed it forward, applied opposite rudder, and reduced the throttle. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The spin continued, the earth rushing up to meet her. "Stay with the plane, Evie," she heard her father's voice. "Don't fight her. Guide her." She held the controls steady, her knuckles white. Then slowly she felt the spin begin to loosen its grip. The nose dipped, and the blur outside began to resolve itself back into a sky and a horizon. The Hornet was flying again. She was out of the spin. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, and her flight suit was soaked with sweat. She leveled out, her breath coming in ragged gasps. JP's advice hadn't been friendly. It had been sabotage. He'd had known exactly what would happen. In a Rafale with its advanced flight controls and powerful canards, the maneuver might have worked. But in a Hornet, it was a recipe for disaster. He had tried to make her crash. He had tried to take her out of the competition, maybe for good. A cold, hard anger settled in Eve's chest. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about justice. She flew back to the base, her jaw set. The game had changed, and Jean-Pierre had just made a very big mistake. Eve didn't report the incident, not officially. Who would believe her? It would be her word against the charming, celebrated French pilot. They would call it pilot error. They would say the American woman in the old jet couldn't handle the pressure. Colonel Thorne would ground her in a heartbeat for reckless flying. No, she couldn't fight this battle in an office. She had to fight it in the sky. But the near disaster had given her an unexpected gift, a weapon. JP had shown his hand. He had revealed a weakness, not in her plane, but in his own character. He was arrogant. He believed she was predictable. And he had inadvertently told her exactly what he was afraid of. Her ability to push her older jet to its absolute limits using pure skill. That night, Eve didn't sleep. She sat in the sparse, temporary barracks with her laptop, pulling up the flight data from her spin. She replayed the sensor readings over and over, watching the numbers that represented the violent chaos she had experienced. She saw the exact moment the rudder input had sent the plane into a spin. But she also saw something else. In the split second before the spin became unrecoverable, the Hornet had twisted into a position of incredible aerodynamic potential. It was an unstable, dangerous attitude, but for a fleeting moment it offered an angle of attack that was theoretically impossible. JP's advice was poison, but the poison contained a hidden key. He thought he was telling her how to crash. But what if he had accidentally told her how to fly in a way no one had ever seen before? The next day she went to Sal. She found him in the hangar, long after the other crews had gone, gently polishing the canopy of her Hornet. She laid her laptop on a nearby toolbox and showed him the data. She didn't tell him about JP. She just framed it as a theory. "What if," she said, tracing the spike on the graph with her finger, "instead of a full rudder kick, I just gave it a tap? A quick, controlled jab, just enough to yaw the nose without losing control. Could I use that instability to pivot the plane on its axis, almost like a top?" Sal looked at the data for a long time, his brow furrowed. He chewed on his unlit cigar, a habit he'd had for 30 years. "You're talking about controlled departure from flight, Major," he said slowly. "Dancing on a razor's edge. Most pilots spend their whole careers trying to avoid what you're trying to do on purpose." He looked from the laptop screen to her eyes. He saw the fire there, the same look he'd seen in her father's eyes years ago. "The airframe can probably take it," he said. "The question is, can you? You make one mistake, one tiny miscalculation in your timing, and you're not coming back." "I can do it," Eve said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I need the plane to be perfect, Sal. Every wire, every hydraulic line, every control surface. I need you to go over it like it's the only thing keeping your own daughter alive." Sal gave a slow nod. "I always do, Major. I always do." For the next few days, they became ghosts in the machine. While the other pilots attended press events and cocktail parties, Eve and Sal lived in the hangar. He and his small, dedicated crew worked tirelessly, checking and double-checking every component of the Hornet. Eve, meanwhile, spent hours in the simulator, practicing the new maneuver. She crashed a dozen times, 100 times. The simulated alarms became the soundtrack to her life, but slowly, painstakingly, she began to master it. She learned the exact amount of pressure to apply to the rudder, the precise moment to counter it with the stick. She was teaching her body a new language, a new way to feel the airplane. One evening, as she was walking back from the simulators, exhausted and drenched in sweat, she ran into Colonel Thorne. He was standing in the shadows watching her. "You're putting in a lot of hours, Major," he said. It wasn't a question. "The Airshow is about showmanship, not about burning yourself out." "I'll be ready, Colonel," Eve replied, her gaze unwavering. Thorne took a step closer. His voice was lower now, and for the first time, she detected something other than disapproval in it. It might have been concern. "I reviewed the telemetry from your practice flight 3 days ago," he said. "You had a spin event at 20,000 feet. You didn't report it." Eve's blood ran cold. Of course he knew. He saw everything. "It was a controlled exercise, Colonel. I was testing the edge of the envelope." It was a weak lie, and they both knew it. Thorne stared at her for a long moment. "Your father, Captain Reed," he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "He was one of the best I ever saw. He also believed in testing the envelope. Sometimes the envelope pushes back. Be careful, Major. There's a difference between being brave and being reckless." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving Eve standing in the humid night air, his words echoing in her ears. He had known her father. The thought sent a strange shiver through her. This whole time, she thought he was judging her against some generic standard. But he was judging her against a legend, her own father. The day of the airshow arrived. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The roar of the crowd was a distant ocean, a wave of anticipation. Eve stood by her Hornet, watching the other jets take their turn. The Russian Su-30 performed its famous Cobra maneuver, the jet seeming to stand on its tail in midair, a breathtaking display of raw power. Then came JP in his Rafale. He flew a routine of flawless high-speed passes and impossibly tight turns. He was a master, and his jet was a marvel of technology. As he landed, he taxied past her, lifting his canopy and giving her a smug, triumphant smile. The crowd was going wild. The commentators were gushing about the superiority of the French aircraft. The pressure was immense. Sal gave her a thumbs up as she climbed into the cockpit. "Give 'em hell, Major." Eve strapped herself in. She looked at the small, faded photo of her father she had tucked into the corner of the instrument panel. "It's not about the plane, kiddo," his smiling eyes seemed to say. "It's about the pilot." She keyed her mic, her voice calm and clear. "Tower, Valkyrie 1 is ready." Taking the active runway, it was time to fly. The moment her wheels left the runway, the world outside the cockpit disappeared. The roar of the crowd, the pressure, the other pilots, it all melted away, replaced by the familiar hum of the Hornet's electronics and the thunder of its engines. There was only the sky, the machine, and her. She began her routine just as she had practiced, a powerful, confident climb that ripped through the air. From the ground, it looked standard, professional. Colonel Thorne watched from the VIP tent, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. JP, the French pilot, stood with his team, a dismissive smirk on his face. He was expecting the conservative flight Thorne had ordered. He was expecting the old bird to put on a polite, forgettable show. Eve followed her initial climb with a series of crisp, perfectly executed barrel rolls and high G turns. She was a painter, and the sky was her canvas. She flew with a precision that the more powerful jets, with their computerized flight controls, often lacked. They flew with overwhelming force. She flew with an artist's touch. The crowd was appreciative, offering polite applause. They recognized the skill, but they were still waiting for the shock and awe they had seen from the Rafale and the Su-30. Eve knew this. This was just the prelude. This was the setup. Then she did it. She pulled the Hornet's nose up, straight towards the sun, climbing vertically until the plane seemed to run out of energy, hanging suspended between the earth and the heavens. The crowd grew quiet. They recognized the start of a stall turn, a common enough maneuver. JP watched, his smirk widening. This was the moment he had tried to exploit, the moment he expected her to be clumsy. From his perspective, she was about to perform a sloppy, energy-losing turn. But Eve didn't perform a standard stall turn. At the very peak of her climb, as the jet hung in the balance, she did what she had practiced 100 times in the simulator. She didn't kick the rudder, she tapped it. A quick, sharp jab. For a split second, the Hornet shuddered, departing from controlled flight. From the ground, it looked like a mistake. A gasp went through the crowd. Colonel Thorne tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the radio handset on his belt. JP's smirk turned into a look of confusion. Then the magic happened. Instead of tumbling out of the sky, the Hornet pivoted. Not on its wings, but on its center, like a spinning top. The nose whipped around in a dizzyingly fast, flat rotation. It wasn't a turn, it was a pirouette, a move that should not have been possible. She had used the instability, the very thing JP had tried to use against her, and turned it into a breathtaking spectacle. She had weaponized his sabotage. Before the plane could enter a full spin, she countered with the stick and rudder, her timing perfect to the millisecond. The Hornet locked back into controlled flight, its nose now pointing straight down at the earth. The crowd, which had been holding its collective breath, let out a massive unified roar. It was a sound of disbelief and astonishment. No one had ever seen an A-18 do that. The commentators were fumbling for words, their professional calm shattered. I don't even know what to call that. One of them stammered into his microphone. That was impossible. JP's face was a mask of shock. His jaw was literally hanging open. He recognized the initial movement, the rudder input he had suggested. He had given her the ingredients for a disaster, and she had used them to cook up a miracle. He looked at her jet, now screaming towards the ground in a controlled dive, and he understood. She had known. She had beaten him at his own game. But Eve wasn't finished. As she pulled out of the dive, leveling off just above the runway, she prepared for her final. The maneuver her father had called the Hawk's Talon. It was more than just a trick, it was a tribute. It was a conversation with her past, with the man who had taught her to fly. She pulled back on the stick again, another vertical climb, even more aggressive this time. Again she reached the apex, the point of zero energy. But this time she let the plane stall completely. The nose dropped, and the Hornet began to fall backwards, tail first towards the ground. It was a terrifying sight, a 40,000-pound jet falling like a leaf. Inside the cockpit, Eve was calm. She felt the plane. She listened to the air rushing over the control surfaces. "Wait for it, Evie," her father's voice whispered in her memory. "Feel the moment." She waited. 1 second. 2 seconds. The ground rushed closer. Then, at the last possible moment, she pushed the stick forward and slammed the throttles to their maximum. The engines roared to life, and the Hornet's nose snapped down. The plane flipped over, completing a backwards somersault, and rocketed away, parallel to the runway, leaving a trail of thunder in its wake. The crowd erupted. The sound was deafening. It wasn't just applause. It was a raw, emotional release. They had witnessed something special, something that transcended technology and horsepower. They had seen the heart of a pilot on full display. In the VIP tent, Colonel Thorne slowly lowered his hand from the radio. He stared at the sky where Eve's Hornet had been, and a slow, small smile touched his lips. It was the first time any of his pilots had ever seen him smile on duty. Eve flew one final graceful pass along the runway, waggling her wings in salute to the roaring crowd. As she banked towards the landing pattern, she looked at the small photo on her dash. The airshow was over. She had done it. She had honored her father, and she had shown them all what a girl and an old bird could do. Landing was almost an out-of-body experience. The adrenaline was still pumping through Eve's veins, but a deep sense of calm had settled over her. She taxied her Hornet back to its designated spot on the flight line, the roar of the crowd still echoing in her ears. As she shut down the engines, the sudden silence was profound. For a moment she just sat in the cockpit, her hands resting on the controls, feeling the gentle ticking of the cooling metal. She had done it. She had flown her heart out. Whatever happened next, no one could ever take that away from her. When she finally unstrapped and climbed down the ladder, she was met by a scene of chaos. A swarm of reporters and airshow officials were being held back by security. Her ground crew, led by Sal, was waiting for her. Sal didn't say a word. He just walked up, took her helmet from her, and pulled her into a rough, one-armed hug that smelled of grease and pride. The rest of the crew erupted in cheers, patting her on the back. Across the tarmac she saw the other American pilots. The young lieutenants who had whispered about her were now staring with open-mouthed awe. They looked at her with a newfound respect that was more satisfying than any trophy. Then she saw the French team. They were packing up their equipment in a hurry. JP was nowhere to be seen. An airshow official, a polite but firm Malaysian man, approached her. "Major Reed, an incredible performance," he said with a deep, respectful bow. "The judges have reviewed the telemetry from all the flights." There was an inquiry regarding the French team. It appears their pilot was disqualified for unsportsmanlike conduct. There is evidence of him providing dangerous advice to a competitor. "Congratulations, Major. You have been awarded Best in Show." Eve was stunned. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't needed it. Her victory had already been won in the sky. But she nodded graciously. "Thank you, sir." The real prize, however, was yet to come. Through the crowd, a path cleared. Colonel Marcus Thorne was walking towards her. He moved with the same deliberate, no-nonsense stride as always, but his face was different. The hard granite mask was gone. As he reached her, he stopped and simply looked at her for a moment. The crowd fell silent watching. "Major Reed," he began, his voice quiet, meant for her alone. "In my office, I ordered you to fly a conservative routine." "Yes, Colonel," Eve said, her back straight, ready for the reprimand she knew she deserved for disobeying a direct order. Thorne shook his head slowly. "That was an order given by a commander who saw only the airframe. I forgot that it's the pilot who makes the difference." He paused, and his next words seemed to cost him an effort. "I was wrong. What you did up there, it was not reckless. It was brave. It was brilliant." He extended his hand. "Your father would have been proud." Eve felt a lump form in her throat. She shook his hand, his grip firm and steady. "Thank you, Colonel. That means everything." "I knew your father," Thorne continued, his voice softer now. "We flew together a long time ago. He was a hawk, always pushing the limits. I see the same fire in you. I was afraid of it. Afraid you'd push too far, just like you did sometimes. I let that fear cloud my judgment. I underestimated you, Major. And for that, I apologize." An apology? From Colonel Thorne. It was more shocking than any maneuver she had performed. It was the ultimate validation, a sign that she had not only earned her place, but had changed the mind of a man who seemed unchangeable. Later that evening, long after the crowds had gone home and the sun had set, Eve stood alone on the quiet flight line. The air was cool now, and the stars were beginning to appear in the dark sky. She walked over to her Hornet, Old Faithful, and placed a hand on its nose. The metal was cool to the touch. It wasn't the newest or the fastest plane at the Airshow. It wasn't a Rafale or an Su-30, but it was her plane. And today they had danced together. They had shown the world that courage and skill were more powerful than any technology. The whispers and the doubts were gone, replaced by the quiet hum of respect. She had faced injustice, sabotage, and the long shadow of her father's legacy. And she had won, not by being better than anyone else, but by being true to herself. She looked up at the stars, feeling her father's presence in the gentle night breeze. The twist wasn't that she had won the competition. It was that she had won the one thing that truly mattered: peace. She had finally proven, not just to the world, but to herself, that she was her father's daughter, a hawk in her own right.